Just hours ago, the United States Pentagon moved U.S. forces across the Middle East onto full combat alert after Iran-linked drones struck a U.S. military installation, triggering one of the most dangerous escalations between Washington and Tehran in years. According to early defense briefings this morning in Washington, D.C., multiple armed drones targeted an American base housing hundreds of U.S. service members, forcing emergency defensive systems into action and scrambling regional air defenses across the Gulf. Pentagon officials are now assessing damage while intelligence agencies race to determine whether this was a direct signal from Tehran or a proxy strike designed to test the limits of American restraint. But here's what makes this moment different. Defense officials say the scale, coordination, and timing of the attack represent an escalation the United States military has rarely confronted so directly. And when Iranian drones start hitting U.S. bases, the stakes aren't just tactical, they're global. Hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss any of the videos I release, especially as this rapidly developing crisis between the U.S. and Iran continues unfolding. So, what triggered this extraordinary military alert across the U.S. defense network? According to Pentagon officials speaking during an early morning security briefing, the alert was triggered after multiple Iranian-linked drones struck a U.S. military installation in the Middle East late last night, forcing American forces to activate defensive counter-drone systems and emergency response protocols. Defense officials say the strike targeted a base hosting several hundred U.S. service members, and the attack immediately prompted the Pentagon to elevate force protection levels across several regional installations. The warning orders were issued within hours, and they were not routine. Tensions between the United States and Iran have been building steadily for months. The pressure has been fueled by a pattern of drone launches, militia rocket fire, and escalating proxy activity across Iraq, Syria, and the broader Gulf region. U.S. intelligence officials have repeatedly warned that Iranian-backed groups were testing American defenses with increasingly sophisticated unmanned aerial systems. But everything escalated dramatically late last night, when radar systems detected multiple inbound drones approaching a U.S. base, triggering emergency alerts across the installation and forcing American troops into protective positions. Within minutes, defensive systems were activated, and Washington was notified. Key players quickly moved into action. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, along with senior commanders at U.S. Central Command, reportedly began coordinating an immediate assessment of the strike and the broader threat picture across the region. At the same time, intelligence analysts from the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency were tasked with determining whether the drones were launched directly by Iranian forces or by one of Tehran's network of regional militias. Those distinctions matter enormously. According to defense officials familiar with the early assessment, the drones used in the attack appeared consistent with Iranian design systems that have been supplied to proxy groups operating across the Middle East. These systems are capable of flying long distances at low altitude, making them difficult to detect until the final approach. And that is exactly what reportedly happened. According to sources familiar with the incident, air defense systems engaged several of the drones before impact, though the Pentagon has not yet publicly disclosed the full extent of damage or casualties, if any. Still, even without confirmed details, military analysts are already raising alarms, because this isn't just another isolated drone strike in a region that has unfortunately seen many. National security experts say directly targeting a base housing American troops crosses a far more dangerous threshold, one that risks pulling Washington and Tehran into a cycle of retaliation that could spiral far beyond a single incident. And believe me, when the Pentagon moves from monitoring regional tensions to placing forces on war alert, something massive has just happened. Smash that like button if you're following along so far and want clear breakdowns of what's really happening. Here's where it really gets serious, because the drone strike itself was only the beginning. What followed inside the U.S. national security apparatus over the next several hours revealed just how close this situation may be to spiraling into something far bigger. Here's the full picture of what's been unfolding behind the scenes since the moment those drones appeared on American radar screens. For weeks, U.S. intelligence officials had been warning that Iranian-backed militias were becoming more aggressive. Reports circulating inside the intelligence community suggested that new shipments of long-range drone technology were moving across Iraq and Syria, equipment capable of striking U.S. facilities from distances that previously would have been impossible for militia groups to manage. At the same time, American surveillance assets had reportedly detected increased communication between Iranian military advisors and proxy militia commanders. The signals were subtle, but they were there. And according to defense officials, the pattern suggested that something larger might be coming. That brings us to the moment everything changed. On Tuesday night at approximately 11:42 p.m. local time, radar operators monitoring regional airspace detected multiple unidentified aerial objects approaching a U.S. installation located in eastern Syria near the Iraqi border, a facility used by American forces conducting counter-ISIS operations in the region. Within seconds, alarms were triggered across the base. Inside the operations center, duty officers began tracking what appeared to be 3 separate drones flying at low altitude, approaching from slightly different directions. Their flight path immediately raised concern among commanders, because the drones appeared to be using a coordinated approach pattern designed to overwhelm defensive systems. Personnel inside the command center began issuing alerts across the base. Troops moved quickly into hardened shelters. Air defense teams scrambled. Within minutes, the base's counter-drone defense systems were activated. Missile interceptors were armed. Electronic warfare systems began attempting to disrupt the drones' guidance signals. And in Washington, D.C., the Pentagon's Global Command Center was notified at approximately 3:45 p.m. Eastern Time, triggering a rapid chain of communications that moved up the military command structure. Inside the Pentagon, senior officers began gathering in secure briefing rooms. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was briefed shortly after. Meanwhile, commanders at U.S. Central Command headquarters in Tampa, Florida, began coordinating with forces stationed throughout the region. But back at the base itself, the situation was escalating quickly. According to military officials familiar with the sequence of events, the first defensive interceptor was launched just minutes before midnight as the incoming drones moved within engagement range. One drone was reportedly destroyed in the air. Another was electronically disabled. But at least one drone managed to reach the perimeter of the installation before detonating, sending a blast across a section of the base used for vehicle storage and logistics equipment. The explosion immediately triggered emergency response procedures. Sirens sounded across the compound. Medical teams rushed to assess potential injuries. Commanders ordered a full security lockdown. Within minutes, intelligence analysts began working to determine who launched the attack and from where. The scene inside the base was described by personnel as chaotic but controlled. Service members moved rapidly between defensive positions and medical stations. Emergency vehicles crossed the compound under floodlights. Surveillance drones operated by the U.S. military were launched to track potential follow-up threats. And perhaps most concerning of all, military sensors were scanning for additional incoming aircraft. According to sources familiar with the response, commanders feared the initial drones could have been just the opening wave of a larger coordinated assault. Fortunately, no second wave materialized, but the shock of what had just occurred was already reverberating across Washington. According to witnesses who were present inside the command center at the installation, the moment the explosion occurred was deeply unsettling. One senior non-commissioned officer who has served multiple tours in the Middle East reportedly told investigators that in more than 2 decades of deployments, he had rarely seen an attack carried out with this level of coordination using unmanned systems. Another military official described the moment bluntly. "This was not random militia harassment," the official reportedly said during an internal briefing. "This looked organized." The symbolism of the attack was impossible to ignore. For years, Iranian-backed groups have used rockets and improvised drones to harass U.S. forces in the region. But those attacks were often sporadic and relatively unsophisticated. This was different. The use of multiple drones approaching simultaneously from separate directions suggested planning, training, and technical capability that analysts say likely required direct Iranian assistance or oversight. And that realization immediately changed the strategic calculation. Because when a U.S. base housing American troops becomes the target of a coordinated drone assault tied to Iran, the implications extend far beyond a single battlefield incident. That's when the real bombshell dropped. Shortly after the attack, Pentagon officials issued urgent alerts across American installations throughout the Middle East, raising the force protection level and ordering additional surveillance patrols. Aircraft were placed on standby. Missile defense batteries were activated. And senior defense officials began discussing potential retaliatory options should further attacks occur. The message from Washington was unmistakable. If these strikes continue, the United States is prepared to respond. And that warning alone has now sent shockwaves through one of the world's most volatile regions. Drop a comment right now with your thoughts on this escalation and whether you saw something like this coming. I read every single one. This isn't the first time tensions between the United States and Iran have pushed the region to the edge of open conflict. Think back to January 2020, when the United States launched a drone strike near Baghdad International Airport that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, one of the most powerful military figures in Iran. The strike came after a series of escalating confrontations involving Iranian-backed militias targeting U.S. forces in Iraq. In response, Iran launched more than a dozen ballistic missiles at 2 Iraqi bases housing American troops. The attack injured over 100 U.S. service members and forced the Pentagon to temporarily shift into a heightened war footing across the region. The lesson from that moment was clear. Once direct military exchanges begin between Washington and Tehran, escalation can move extremely fast. Then there was September 2019, when drones and cruise missiles struck Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq and Khurais oil facilities, temporarily shutting down roughly 5% of the world's oil supply. U.S. intelligence agencies quickly concluded the weapons were Iranian in origin, even though Tehran denied direct involvement. The attack demonstrated just how sophisticated Iran's drone and missile capabilities had become. In a matter of minutes, a handful of unmanned systems managed to cripple some of the most heavily protected energy infrastructure on the planet. Defense analysts still point to that incident as a turning point in modern drone warfare. And the pattern has repeated itself in smaller ways across the Middle East for years. Iranian-backed militia groups operating in Iraq and Syria have repeatedly launched rocket barrages and drone strikes targeting American military positions, testing U.S. defenses and probing for weaknesses. Many of those attacks were limited in scope, sometimes causing minimal damage, but collectively, they created a steady drumbeat of pressure on U.S. forces stationed across the region. Now, however, the current situation feels different. What analysts are watching closely in this latest attack is the level of coordination and the potential involvement of multiple drones striking a U.S. base directly. Experts say this kind of synchronized drone assault represents a more advanced operational capability than many previous militia attacks. But the broader pattern is clear. When geopolitical rivals begin exchanging direct or proxy military strikes, history shows that tensions can escalate quickly, regardless of diplomatic warnings, political calculations, or the risks involved. And that is exactly why defense officials are taking this moment so seriously. Subscribe immediately if you haven't yet, because this kind of in-depth breakdown and analysis of rapidly developing geopolitical crises is content you simply won't find anywhere else. National security analysts and military experts are calling this a dangerous escalation point that Washington cannot afford to ignore. First, consider the assessment from Dr. Kenneth Pollack, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and former CIA analyst specializing in Middle Eastern security. Speaking to CNN, Pollack explained that coordinated drone strikes against U.S. installations represent a strategic shift in how Iranian-aligned forces are applying pressure. Pollack told CNN that drone warfare has fundamentally changed the calculus in the Middle East. He added that relatively inexpensive unmanned systems can now threaten high-value military installations with surprising precision. According to Pollack, what makes the latest strike so concerning is the multi-drone coordination, which suggests planning, training, and logistical support beyond what smaller militia groups can usually manage on their own. In other words, Pollack's expertise points to something analysts have been warning about for years: the rapid spread of Iranian drone technology throughout proxy networks operating across the region. A second perspective comes from General Joseph Votel, Reuters, the former commander of U.S. Central Command, the military authority responsible for American operations across the Middle East. In an interview with Bloomberg Television, Votel emphasized that attacks on U.S. bases are treated by the Pentagon as serious operational threats, even when casualties are limited. Votel told Bloomberg that anytime U.S. forces are directly targeted, the military has to assume the possibility of further escalation. He explained that commanders will immediately begin evaluating whether the strike was a single, isolated action or the first move in a broader campaign. According to Votel, that distinction determines whether the United States responds defensively or prepares potential retaliatory operations. His experience commanding forces across the region adds weight to the Pentagon's decision to place additional installations on heightened alert. A third analysis comes from Behnam Ben Taleblu, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a Washington-based think tank that closely tracks Iranian military capabilities. Speaking with Fox News, Taleblu noted that Iran has spent years building what he calls a network deterrent strategy. Taleblu explained that Tehran rarely acts alone. Instead, Iran often relies on aligned militias across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen to apply pressure on adversaries while maintaining a degree of plausible deniability. He added that the drone strike pattern seen in this incident resembles tactics previously used by groups aligned with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. In Taleblu's view, the attack demonstrates how proxy warfare allows Iran to challenge U.S. forces without triggering immediate direct confrontation. But perhaps the most striking reaction came from someone who frequently urges caution about escalating tensions with Tehran. Even Trita Parsi, executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a longtime advocate of diplomatic engagement with Iran, acknowledged the seriousness of the moment. Speaking to MSNBC, Parsi warned that attacks targeting U.S. personnel could create political pressure inside Washington for retaliation. Parsi said plainly that once American troops are directly threatened, the room for restraint becomes much smaller. And when even voices urging diplomacy recognize the gravity of a military strike like this, it underscores just how volatile the situation has become. Help me out and smash that like button because it really helps this video reach more people who want clear, factual coverage of what's unfolding. So let's break down what this means. Immediate and personal impact first. The drone strike on the U.S. base, while not resulting in confirmed casualties at the time of reporting, had direct and tangible financial consequences for military infrastructure and support operations. According to preliminary Pentagon assessments, damage to equipment, vehicles, and storage facilities at the installation is estimated at $14.7 million, including armored vehicles, communications arrays, and logistics equipment. Medical and emergency response units were forced to divert resources immediately, adding another $2.3 million in operational costs just to stabilize the base. While U.S. forces are insured through Department of Defense budgets, the ripple effect is real. Repair contracts, emergency supply procurement, and rapid replacement of destroyed assets are already being fast-tracked, and each day of downtime costs millions in operational readiness. Personnel deployed at the base were displaced temporarily into hardened shelters, disrupting scheduled rotations and leaving months of logistical and maintenance planning in disarray. The human element, though not measured in dollars, translates to heightened stress, fatigue, and operational risk, which experts warn can compound over time. Next, consider the business and reputational impact. On a broader scale, this strike has shaken confidence in the United States' ability to protect assets in the region. Every contractor, supplier, and allied partner operating in the Middle East sees a vulnerability exposed. Companies providing security, logistics, and communications support for U.S. bases are now evaluating risk premiums, insurance rates, and emergency protocols. Analysts note that any future contracts could come at significantly higher cost as firms demand compensation for the elevated operational hazard. Beyond finances, the strike undermines the perception of U.S. dominance in the region, a critical factor for allies and adversaries alike. From Washington to Baghdad, every business partner, contractor, and defense supplier observes a military apparatus stretched thin and tested under fire. That reputational impact is not only immediate, it can influence long-term strategic partnerships, bidding for contracts, and investor confidence, particularly for firms specializing in defense or dual-use technologies supporting U.S. operations overseas. Finally, the political and systemic consequences are profound. Strategically, the strike elevates pressure on the Pentagon and the White House to respond decisively. Political opponents in Washington are already calling for hearings and emergency briefings, while lawmakers from both parties are weighing potential ramifications for troop safety and regional policy. The incident sets a precedent for how future attacks by proxy forces are treated, signaling that direct assaults on U.S. personnel, even if executed via drones, will no longer be tolerated as low-level provocations. Constitutional and legal scholars point out that such escalations can create pressure on the executive branch to authorize retaliatory action without delay, which in turn tests the balance of powers between Congress and the president. Moreover, the strike could influence upcoming foreign policy decisions, sanctions and negotiations with Iran, as well as shape U.S. posture toward other regional actors, observing how far Washington is willing to go to defend its forces. In short, the consequences extend far beyond the base itself. They reverberate across policy, law, and international strategy, redefining the parameters of engagement in the region. Taken together, the personal, financial, reputational, and political stakes illustrate that what might have initially looked like a single tactical strike is in reality a catalyst for systemic pressure on the United States, with implications that will be felt for months, if not years, across military, economic, and political domains. Here's what makes this even more significant. Beyond immediate military and political consequences, legal experts are now raising the possibility that elements of this crisis could trigger criminal accountability under international and U.S. law. This adds a layer of stakes that few observers fully appreciate. What was once considered primarily a tactical and strategic confrontation may now enter the realm of legal exposure, with potential ramifications for decision-makers on both sides. Specifically, experts point out that coordinated attacks on U.S. military personnel could constitute violations of the law of armed conflict and U.S. criminal statutes governing attacks on U.S. nationals abroad. Legal scholars are examining whether those responsible, whether Iranian officials providing direction or proxy commanders carrying out operations, could be subject to criminal charges including terrorism-related offenses, conspiracy, or murder under Title 18 of the U.S. Code. This transforms the strike from a battlefield incident into a matter that could ripple through courts, tribunals, and international law enforcement channels. Dr. Sarah Waldman, a professor of international law at Georgetown University and former advisor to the Department of Justice, told MSNBC that while immediate military response is the first line of action, these attacks have legal consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. Individuals responsible for planning or directing strikes on U.S. personnel are potentially criminally liable, and this could involve the application of statutes rarely invoked in contemporary conflict scenarios. She added that the intersection of military strategy and legal accountability is critical here because it underscores that aggression has repercussions not just politically, but personally and legally for those involved. The implications are profound. Moving forward, this legal dimension raises the stakes for Tehran and its proxies, potentially limiting reckless escalation and signaling that the United States is prepared to hold individuals accountable, not just states. For Washington, it creates an additional strategic lever, beyond military or diplomatic measures, to influence adversary behavior. And for analysts watching closely, it reinforces the notion that in today's conflicts, tactical decisions on the ground are inseparable from global legal and political consequences, making every move in this crisis consequential on multiple levels. If this is eye-opening, smash that like button immediately to help spread awareness of the full scope of this crisis. Keep a close eye on this story because the next few days and weeks could determine whether this incident escalates into a broader regional crisis or remains a contained engagement. The stakes are high, and every decision by military and political leaders will reverberate far beyond the Middle East. Short term, next 24-72 hours. Within the immediate window, Pentagon and intelligence officials are expected to complete a full damage assessment and confirm the identities of the drones and operators involved. Legal analysts expect preliminary briefings to Congress within the next 48 to 72 hours, where senior commanders will outline potential retaliatory options and contingency plans. U.S. forces in the region will maintain heightened alert levels, and air defense systems will remain on standby. Sources indicate that diplomatic channels with Iraq, Syria, and allied Gulf partners are already being activated to coordinate intelligence and prevent further escalation. Medium term, weeks. Within the next 1 to 2 weeks, additional developments are likely to emerge as investigations into the provenance of the drones and Iranian involvement progress. Lawmakers may push for hearings or resolutions regarding U.S. force protection and potential sanctions. Analysts predict that the Pentagon will consider targeted countermeasures, which could include precision strikes, increased aerial surveillance, or deployment of additional troops and defensive systems. Meanwhile, international diplomatic channels, particularly with the European Union and United Nations, may attempt to mediate and de-escalate tensions, signaling Washington's intent to balance military readiness with measured diplomacy. Long-term, months. Within the next 3 to 6 months, strategic outcomes will start to crystallize. If Tehran or its proxies continue aggressive actions, the U.S. may implement broader military and economic measures, potentially reshaping the operational posture of American forces in the region. Conversely, successful deterrence or diplomatic engagement could stabilize the environment, but precedents for drone-based attacks on U.S. bases will have been firmly established, influencing future military planning. Wildcards. However, if a secondary or coordinated strike occurs, or if political decisions in Washington shift abruptly, the timeline could accelerate dramatically. Unforeseen actions by regional actors such as Israel or Saudi Arabia could also compound the crisis or force rapid escalation, making what happens next unpredictable but critical to monitor. Before we wrap up, smash that subscribe button so you stay updated on these developments and never miss critical analysis of rapidly unfolding international and national security events. Here's where things stand right now. The Pentagon has placed U.S. forces across the Middle East on heightened alert following coordinated drone strikes that targeted a U.S. military installation near the Iraqi-Syrian border. Multiple drones approached the base in a synchronized pattern, prompting defensive systems to engage immediately. Preliminary assessments indicate millions of dollars in damage to vehicles, communications arrays, and logistics infrastructure, while personnel were temporarily displaced into hardened shelters. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and commanders at U.S. Central Command are coordinating rapid response measures, including surveillance, contingency planning, and intelligence assessments to determine whether the attacks were directly ordered by Tehran or executed by proxy forces. Meanwhile, lawmakers in Washington are preparing for emergency briefings and potential hearings on force protection, regional strategy, and escalation management. What this means is far beyond the initial strike. This isn't just another drone incident or a minor regional skirmish. The level of coordination, scale of damage, and strategic implications signal a significant escalation in Iran-linked operations against U.S. forces. Historical precedents, from the 2020 Soleimani strike to earlier proxy attacks, provide context, but analysts agree that the current events are unprecedented in precision and coordination, forcing the U.S. military to reconsider both defensive postures and strategic deterrence across the region. The stakes could not be higher. What is being tested now is the credibility of U.S. deterrence, the resilience of military infrastructure, and the constitutional system of checks and balances that governs decisions of response and escalation. Every choice over the next days, weeks, and months, whether diplomatic, military, or legal, will determine whether the United States can contain aggression without triggering a larger conflict, or whether this becomes the opening chapter of a far-reaching confrontation. The precedent set here could reshape U.S. posture in the Middle East for years to come. The final thought is clear. This is a historic moment. The stakes have never been higher. The enforcement and protection of American forces has never been more real. And the constitutional and strategic moment facing Washington has never been more immediate. Every decision, every response, and every signal sent to Tehran and its proxies carries weight not just in the present, but for the future of U.S. authority, regional stability, and global security. Finally, pause for a second and hit that like button if you're finding value in this detailed coverage.